right, y'all. Welcome back to the Blessed Beyond Measure podcast. I'm your host, CL The Source, your friendly neighborhood hope dealer. I'm here with a special guest today. Her name is Stacie Danielle. She just told me I could just call her Stacie the whole time now. So today she's a real cool guest. She was featured on my man Trev Smooth's podcast recently, Chew the Fat with Trev Smooth. And, me and her have been connected on Instagram for a few weeks now. Her content is really great stuff. I took a look at all of the work that she's doing and really just found her so fascinating and interesting. And I really wanted to get her on this podcast to get to know her more and ask her some real cool questions because a lot of her work deals in mental health and a lot of healing. And her brand is titled Reclaimed, as you can see on her sweatshirt. It's a beautiful sweatshirt, by the way. And she's just a really beautiful soul. And I really just kind of wanted to get to know her. Stacie Danielle, how are you today?
I'm good. Yeah, it's sunny, so I can't ever complain about that.
Nice. And she's joining us from Los Angeles, California, correct?
Yeah, right now I'm in LA.
Gotcha. And before we get started, I just wanted to shout out my boy, OG Hatch. This is something I want to add to the podcast going forward is just checking in with my guest. I just want to check in with you, see how you're doing from a mental health standpoint. Can you share a little bit about how you're doing today?
Yeah, I think for the most part, I'm pretty good mentally. Yeah, just kind of getting my day started for the most part, just rolling with it, open to the possibilities of today.
I love that. It's important to remain open, right? In terms of just receiving from the universe. I don't know if you really on that spiritual wavelength. I'm sure we'll get to know that at some point, but yeah, I fully agree. But anyway, Stacie, thank you once again for joining us. I really appreciate your time. I'm fully aware that time is our most valuable asset. I know you got 2 kids. I know you're busy building your brand. You're doing your thing. Yeah. So, time is important. So thank you so much for spending your time with us.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you for having me. I definitely appreciate it. Like I said, I've looked at your stuff, your content, and yeah, I was just super moved by it. Like I was on Trey's podcast and I was like, it's nice to just build a network of connections of different people, but also just, hearing other people's stories is always something that I enjoy doing. So yeah.
Absolutely. And I've been excited about this since we set this up last week. I was like, yeah, well, we've been following each other for a minute now, but after really kind of getting to know you from Trev's podcast, I was just like, man, yeah, I got to get her on my podcast. I got some questions that I kind of want to ask you and stuff like that. I know that I think you mentioned you're studying to be a therapist. Is that correct?
Yeah. So I have a bachelor's in psychology, a master's in social work. And so it's just more so in a sense of just getting like the licensing done in order to become a therapist. So like my main focus, like honestly, even through my undergrad was like social psychology. Like I'm so fascinated by people and just the way they like operate in social settings that has like always been like just kind of like me as an observer. And so I did a lot of like social work in the community, like helping out the homeless population, getting them into supportive housing, which I genuinely enjoyed doing. But even though I was working on like such a micro aspect of it, I didn't necessarily want to stay in social work. Like I really felt more called to like the clinical approach of things, of like actually working on that person's like mental health. Like how can we actually get you to a place of stability, like within your mind and your own existence. So then that way we can prevent this from moving forward. So that was a huge focus point of me. It was like, yes, I love the advocacy aspect of social work, but like being able to like meet with my clients, because I had to meet with them monthly or, bi-weekly, depending on what their needs were. There was just that like connection of being able to connect one-on-one more intimately and like really helping them like discover like who they are and like why they've done these patterns and gotten them into a state of homelessness or drug use and stuff like that. So that's something that like I want to continue doing. I don't know if I would like be a like practicing therapist, because, you know, I'm not a huge fan of a lot of the politics in regards to that. And obviously there's a lot of stuff I don't agree with, but yeah, I think it's nice or whatever to have that as an aspect, especially in terms of, I know a lot of people do coaching, but and whatever, they are certified for that. But I think there's still an element of like, okay, like I know what I'm talking about, right? Like I know how to like treat this like clinically. That makes you feel like a little bit more authentic to it. So yeah.
Right. You're coming from that human standpoint rather than from just the, the clinical standpoint that you just referred to. I appreciate that. And, like it's interesting. Like you mentioned politics within, therapy. Like what, can you kind of allude to that a little bit more? Just kind of like, yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, so I think I just have like different views, right? Like I'm not a fan of like medications in general. Like I don't take medicine myself, like down to like an antibiotic or like a pain pill. I genuinely believe that like nature is our medicine. And in terms of like depression and stuff like that, like we consume millions of energies like every single day, like through our fingertips, like through Instagram, the shows that we watch. And I feel like these are directly related to like anxiety and depression, not to mention food is processed so differently nowadays. And this like plays a part, right? So like I'm vegetarian, and for a while I was vegan completely. And I realized how much like it shifted my moods and my energy. Like I had more energy, I had more, I wasn't like as like moody or whatever the case might be. Like I was able to actually get through a complete day like feeling healthy, and not to mention like working out. So I think these all like our environment and the energies that we consume through our food or our social media like really plays a part into the decline of our mental health. So yeah, I'm not like, oh, I get right the chemical imbalance and stuff like that, but I feel like the chemical imbalance is created by what we're doing and by what we're consuming. So that's what I mean by the politics of it. Like I
Wow.
have to be like, wow, you have depression. Like let's treat your depression like with a pill. Like let's give you antidepressant. Like I'm not for that. I'm like, no, what are you doing every day? Like are you waking up in the morning? Like are you eating a healthy breakfast? Like are you working out? Like what's your environment? Like who are around you that's like playing into this? So yeah.
Wow. I'm so glad you said that because I couldn't agree more. And honestly, like when I wasn't too familiar with therapy, I used to kind of shun it. I was like, yo, like I'll be real, like somebody close in my life that was going through some stuff decided to go through therapy, and I was like, why do you need to go through therapy? Like I'm cut from the old school kind of where it's just like you pick up and move forward type shit, you know what I'm saying? And you just kind of and I was just like, therapy, like, why are you going to go to therapy? They're just going to medicate you. They're just going to drug you. Like, you know what I mean? Like, why are you going to do that? And like, I was fearful of that. Now I'm glad you said that because I fully understand, like, this is like, this can be like a whole nother discussion in terms of genetically modified organisms, how the food is raised out here and what that does to your body and from a chemical standpoint. And just, I firmly believe in that whole holistic approach, as it seems that you do too, like just moving your body, fasting when you need to, eating good, clean, healthy foods, drinking water, fruits, vegetables. That could be like our medicine, you know what I mean, in terms of like helping us feel a lot healthier. So what you said is super important. And I'm glad that there are people like you that are going to take that approach, because there are some doctors, I'm sure, as you kind of just pointed to, that'll just be like, oh, you have this, let me just give you this. And then they kind of become dependent on that drug. And then you got a whole nother problem, right?
Yeah. It's a band-aid. Like I just feel like it's a band-aid. It's like, okay, take this. And then you end up having to take like 5 different medications in order to like balance out that one. And it's not getting to the root of the problem. Like
Right.
essentially you're numbing the individual. So then that way they can cope with their depression or their anxiety rather than actually get to the root of the issue. So I just think it's an appropriate approach, and not to like shame all therapists, right? Like I like go to therapy. Like I absolutely adore my therapist, but I think there are a lot of people who inappropriately do it. They're all about pushing medications and big pharma. Big pharma is definitely a real thing. Like we're definitely going to keep bringing in those billions of dollars every single year to them, you know? So yeah.
Yeah, and that could be another discussion too. I'm sure that we can honestly like do so many
Let
different
me not
episodes.
get myself into a hole. I'm trying to get people to like me.
No, but I feel you 100%. I've got some thoughts on that stuff too, which is why like I really just kind of focus on trying to be that change myself rather than like attack the industry at whole. I'd rather just kind of lead by example. And I'm pretty sure you are too. You do too, because you just said that you were vegan and you're vegetarian right now, and you know, you exercise, and like you can really kind of speak from that standpoint on how beneficial that can be. And you pointed to it again, just getting to the root of the problem rather than just putting a band-aid on it. And I think that's super important. So in learning about mental health, like how did you kind of come to that place? You know what I'm saying? Like what kind of pushed you in that direction to want to um kind of understand, well, first of all, understand that that's the root of the problem, and then make that kind of your approach.
Well, I actually started taking like an advanced placement psychology class in high school, and I was like very active back then, right? And there was obviously a lot, like, I mean, you heard Trev's like interview. There was so much going on in my life at that time, but like I genuinely felt healthy, right? Like I didn't feel like my circumstances were as big as they were, but there was also an element of like I was in 3 different sports. I was obviously eating as healthy as I can, like as a teenager. And I genuinely felt good. And I think as I started, you know, experiencing more life, and realized like what I was consuming in those moments, or like what I was doing in those moments, that was really the decline of like my mental health. And then when I moved to Virginia and had this entire like, I don't know, healing process of me like running every day, meditating like in the morning and the night, like I felt clear. And then, you know, then I introduced like processed foods, right? And then my environment shifted to where I was like in an abusive house, and realizing like all of these different elements of my life, of like how different things were in these different times. And I'm like, okay, when did I feel the most clear? And I always felt the most clear when I was like genuinely moving my body, and when I was healthy, and when I was actually in a safe environment. And so for me, that was like always like my big focus. And not to mention, like, I believe in God too. So like, I genuinely believe in like, you know, spirits and demons and stuff like that. And when I worked at the mental health hospital, it was really hard for me to like separate like people's, you know, diagnosis from like what I believe to be true. Oh. And especially in terms of myself, right? Like, cause I had to heal myself. And yeah, I think just from there, I just like started rolling out with it. And I just wanted to learn more, and I wanted to keep learning more. I wanted to learn more about like people's dynamics and their families and stuff like that. And I don't know, I just kind of, I guess I just like, it's always been a mirror for me, like my environment versus other people's environments. Like I always say, like, what makes people more resilient than others? And unfortunately, I think people who have this like poverty mindset end up staying in that. And that's what forces them to be less like resilient than others. So, yeah.
Wow. Thank you for sharing that. And you touched on a lot of different things there. And I was curious about some of those traumatic moments that you went in your life. And you referenced it in the podcast you do with Trev. So anybody that wants to get to know Stacie on that level, just hit up Trev's podcast. I'll put the links in the show notes. But I wanted to ask you, in some of those most traumatic moments, like what were some of the most important lessons that you pulled out of that?
You know, I think some of the most important lessons that I've probably learned through those is like the power of strength, right? Or the power of like actually believing in something. I think once I was able to like really embody like my faith and like genuinely believe that like God would never like put me in a position or whatever that he didn't like intend to like bring a lesson out of it, it really like gave me the grace to power through those moments. And then realizing that like I'm genuinely like never alone. Is something that like I think I've always learned, right? Like I think, you know, when we are going through circumstances in our life, we tend to isolate a little bit more, or we feel like people don't understand or they don't get it. But yeah, just like the power of community and realizing that like even if there's not necessarily a community where you feel like you can like actually open up about that stuff, it's like God is always there, or the universe, right? Whatever people believe in. God is always there, like willing to like listen to us and like help us and give us direction.
Wow, great answer. And thank you for that. And I have to agree in terms of, you're never really alone, when you like love yourself, right? When you're feel like you're alone, just getting to know yourself like is a exercise that you could do like when you have time on your hands, right? And I'm not quite sure if that's exactly what you were like referring to, but
No,
that's kind of what I got from what you said in terms of you're never really alone. And then like you mentioned God, like there's always this infinite intelligence, this infinite energy, whether you call it the universe, God, whatever, Jehovah, any name you want to give it, there's something that's greater. And I think that you're never really alone. And I was curious with you, Stacie. You also talked about it earlier. You had to heal yourself.
mm-hmm.
And how did you begin healing yourself? What were like some of the things that you did to get the wheels in motion?
I genuinely had to sit in everything that was uncomfortable for me. um, I I think there was an element of me, even though like I wasn't much like of a dater, like that wasn't my thing. But there was always someone like within my vicinity, right? Like someone I was like either talking to or engaging to or whatever, sleeping with. Um, and I genuinely had to get to a place where I had to release all of that. Like I literally had to be by myself and sit with being uncomfortable. And through that, I was like, okay, like what makes me like when I first left my husband, I was like, I didn't have my kids as much. And I was like, what do I enjoy doing? Like genuine, like I was like, I didn't even know who I was. And so I started there. Like I started just sitting by myself. I started like going to restaurants by myself. I started drawing, like picking up all of these different new talents and stuff like that. And that was genuinely healing because I was now in a place where even though I felt like I was wounded, like I felt more at peace with being wounded or like facing the obstacles that were like presented to me because I was sitting in this power of like, wow, I finally know who I am. Like I finally know what makes me happy. And I think that's where it started. But then I started like unpacking all of the things that I wasn't, right? Like that like trauma like pushed on me, that the world pushed on me. And from there, I was like, okay, so if that's not who I am, right? Like, let's take piece by piece all of these things that I've told myself over the years that I was, and like, let's really start to begin to reform this identity of who I was innately before all of these like circumstances like went into play. So yeah, so I did a lot of that. Like what do I actually need, right? Like what are my values? Like what are my morals? Like how do I show up in relationships? Like really uncovering like different aspects of like, okay, am I an anxious attacher? Like, am I avoidant attacher? Um, and just really like starting to form boundaries with myself and the relationships around me. So then that way I can genuinely grow.
Wow, that's incredible. Like, I mean, as you were saying that, I was thinking like, especially like when I first started kind of getting to know myself, I used to be afraid to do that. I used to be afraid to just like be on my own and like be with my own thoughts. Cause I was an overthinker for so long. So like a lot of the shit that went through here was like, damn, why are you thinking like that? You know what I'm saying? And like, so I was curious for you, like, how did you summon up that courage to just be on your own and get to know yourself, especially when you said you had a lot of people around you a lot, you know what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, I guess I didn't really have a choice. And it's actually funny because I say this, like when I first left my husband, or for the second time, then the pandemic hit. And even before that, I was basically like working like 3 different jobs. Like I had a full-time job and I had 2 part-time jobs. There were some times where I would literally leave my full-time job, go to one of my part-time jobs, and then go work an overnight and then go to my like full-time job again. And I was doing that consistently. And that's because I was running for myself. Like I was running from like all of these fears of like, all of these fears that were presented in that moment, like such as him like trying to take, the custody of the kids and stuff like that. Like I was genuinely like, I didn't want to be at home. I didn't want to be, and then the pandemic hit. And so then I lost both of my part-time jobs and I only had my full-time job. And I was literally like sitting at home, working from home. And I was like literally like losing my mind, right? Because I am more of an introvert. And even with that, there was still an element of people still being around every day that I would pass. And so I was like, okay, like what is God like teaching me? And I was like, I didn't have a chance to run anymore. Like I was genuinely having to be presented with everything that I was like running away from in that moment. So it was like, thank God for the pandemic, because I don't know if I would have actually grown the way that God intended me to during that period if I would have been like still working on autopilot.
Wow. Wow. Yeah, I mean, first of all, it's good to hear that some good came out of the pandemic, right? And it's funny. Well, not really funny, but I'm pretty sure that you can relate to what I'm about to say. Is like I gained so much from this pandemic myself in terms of getting to know myself. This podcast was birthed from the pandemic. It's about to hit 2 years in April. So it was at the very beginning of the pandemic, right in April, actually, of 2020? Yeah, 2020, when the pandemic first hit. It's even a trip to even just say that, right? Like we've been in this like shelter in place pandemic whole situation for that long. But yeah, I mean, for you, I'm just so glad that like that happened for you. And within saying that, when did you kind of like understand that stuff is happening in your life for you so that you can kind of come to these revelations that you kind of came to? Because you kind of alluded to it. You were just like, yeah, it happened for a greater reason, right? Like you were confronted with all the things that you were like distracting yourself from working 3 jobs and everything like that. So when did you realize it was like, okay, I gotta deal with this shit?
I think pretty early. I think for the first month, I definitely was like pushing, like screaming, or like, and whatever. Like I was definitely like, I don't want to do this. Like, what do I need to do? But I think, probably 2 months in, I was like, okay, right? Like I'm all about like, and I've always been more of an optimistic person. And I think that's what's allowed me to like power through my life so much, is like, okay, like I always see the bigger part of it. Like, okay, maybe that didn't work out or whatever. Let's keep pushing. Let's keep moving, right? Like what else can I do? How can I grow from this? But I think through that, I was like what's actually being presented to me, like, right, like what are the patterns or whatever of my life that have led me to this place. And I'm like I'm in the process of writing a book, and one of One of the chapters is you can run, but you can't hide. And a lot of my life, I've done like a lot of running, from like running away at an early age, or if things get hard, I'll be like, I don't have to deal with this, right? Like, I don't want to do this. And that's my avoidant attachment, is like, for me, I'm just like, okay, I'm just going to disconnect from the situation rather than like actually address it. And that's something that I'm still processing and like trying to heal through. But it's true. Like, you can only run for so long before life is going to be like, yo, like, you better respond, or like, I'm going to like respond for you. And I genuinely believe that, like, even our bodies, right? Like, when we're working on autopilot and we're like, okay, I feel a little sick, but I'm going to keep moving. Like, no, like, our immune system is genuinely going to like shut down because we need that rest. We need that break. And that's essentially what I needed to do in that moment. Like, I needed that rest. I needed that break. And unfortunately, life circumstances forced me to take that break and go inward.
Wow. That's so true. What you just said, in terms of, your body will just kind of whisper to you, like, I'm fatigued, I'm exhausted right now, before you actually have to deal with something more serious. Right. And if you don't pay attention, you're going to be confronted with something even more serious. So, well, that's incredible that you said that. And, like, you, again, going back to your episode with Trev, I learned so much about you, and I got to commend you, Stacie. Honestly, you're such a strong person. And just like, for you to just like maintain this vibrant, radiant spirit that you have, and be that like strength for your kids, you know what I'm saying? And for yourself, obviously, and just really stand in your own power. That's a beautiful thing to see. And honestly, it's like, I'm curious, because you clearly were the victim in a lot of situations in your life, really tough situations. Again, I don't really want to kind of open it up too much, because it's all on the podcast, and I don't really want have to you to have to repeat yourself. But I'm curious, having gone through all of those experiences, and just kind of, like I said, you were the victim in so many of those times. How did you kind of remove yourself from that victim mindset, though? Because you clearly are not the victim anymore. You're like, I'm reclaiming myself, right?
Yeah. I think for me, like, I've never held on to that. I think I've talked about it before, like in one of my posts, where I think a lot of who I have and how I've been able to like show up consistently and embody strength has been, someone has it worse than me, right? And so many people are offended by that, because they think that it's dismissive or it undermines trauma, but it's genuinely true, right? I don't have to attach myself to a mindset or a mentality in order to appease the world, right? It's like, sure, yeah, I can be a victim, I can be a survivor, but like, for me, like, my strength is genuinely from God. So it's like, it's not about like being a survivor. It's about sharing a story and about like allowing people to grow past that mentality. People used to be like, oh, you should join like these support groups. And I'm like, why? So we can like wallow in the moment. Like, I don't want to do that. I don't want to sit in a room full of people who are feeling sorry for themselves. Like, I don't have a backup. Like, I am the backup. Like, I don't have anybody to lean on. Like, I genuinely have to keep pushing, right? Like, my kids rely on me to keep pushing. So it's like, for me to bask in this idea of being a victim or being a survivor isn't conducive to my growth. It isn't conducive to my healing. And so I think, unfortunately, my dismissive mentality in that way has genuinely helped me continue to grow out of that mindset, but also taking accountability of like the moments where I was wrong, right? Like, my first video that I posted on YouTube is all about having self-awareness and being able to take accountability. Like, I'm not perfect. Like I'm a flawed human being. And I can be just as guilty in any situation that I've definitely been in and stuff like that. So obviously outside of me being a child, because that had nothing to do with me, right? Like you can't control that situation. But like, yeah, I think being able to be like, okay, what have my roles been in this situation too? Like, how can I offer grace to myself and how can I offer grace to the other person? Has definitely powered through.
That takes an incredible amount of strength. I gotta say, and you mentioned God several times throughout our conversation thus far, and you mentioned also that your strength genuinely comes from God, and that's a beautiful thing. Now I'm curious because you did also talk about something in the podcast with Trev where your father was a pastor, right? And I think at a point you weren't really believing in God. Is that correct? And did you ultimately just really like refine God or something like that? Or
Yeah, so I think because like my dad like struggled with the drug addiction, and me being raised in the church, I was just like, how does somebody who has so much God in them like do this to their family? And so I think I was just like, went on this, nope, I don't believe in God, right? Like I rebelled out. I definitely did what I wanted to do. But then I had this moment where my ex brought me to the Basilica in Minnesota, and we were just like, whatever, like touring it or checking it out. And I felt such this strong presence. And I was like, and I felt it before, right? Like I felt the Holy Spirit before as a kid. And it was just, I was like, I feel like God is calling me. And so whatever, we end up going back home to LA, and then we end up like moving to Nevada. And so we started going to church again. And so that's when I like rededicated my life to God. But it's like, I think part of me was like, I don't know if I ever actually didn't believe in God. I think there was just so much anger and resentment for my dad that pushed me away from God. And yeah, so I think that's how I got back to it, right? Like I think the Bible says like raise a child in the ways that they should go and they shouldn't depart from it. And so my dad, he genuinely did instill like faith in us and spirituality. And that's just something, unfortunately, that just like stuck with me. And I've just been through way too many situations, like too many close to death situations for me not to believe that there's a God, or just these miraculous situations where I've genuinely kept increasing, right? Like as I've trusted God, as I really like listened to what he wasn't, and I wasn't like rooted in fear, like he's continued to increase me like over the years. And so my faith is a huge part of like who I am.
that's a beautiful thing. That's a beautiful thing. Is now I'm curious. You do got two little ones, two cute little ones. I know that they came in during the podcast episode.
Yeah.
That was such a cute little moment there. I'm curious about your parenting style because in knowing kind of how you were raised and stuff like that and all the different experiences you've been through, I'm pretty sure that would influence the way that you parent. Like, so I'm curious, like, how would you describe your parenting style with your kids?
I'm definitely a hands-on parent. I know that they like I laugh lately of this whole now movement on Instagram of like the progressive parent, as far as like, oh, we don't hit our kids, we don't scream at our kids, we like allow our kids to have an opinion. And that's genuinely me. Like, I mean, whatever, like I'm a flawed human being, right? Like I'll raise my voice, but I also apologize to my kids. Like I'll be like, hey, I'm sorry that I raised my voice, like, and they're like, it's okay. I'm like, actually no, it's not okay. Like I need to control that, right? So I show them that I'm human and I'm a flawed human. And I think that earns the trust of them. But I'm very much hands-on. Like I do things with them. Like my love language is quality time. So I spend as much time with my kids as I possibly can, right? Like we like go out, we'll go to the children's museum. Sometimes we'll have like dance parties in the living room. But and I genuinely allow them to be a free thinker, right? Like they can correct me if I'm wrong and I don't get offended by it. And I think a lot of people should like focus on that, or like kids are genuinely growing. They're trying to navigate their world. They need to be able to feel safe. And you're unfortunately their safe person. So I try to be as safe as possible in the moments that I am not safe with them, right? By like raising my voice, because that is unfortunately damaging to them. I also like give them opportunity to see what a reconciliation looks like and a repair of a relationship looks like when I'm being transparent and apologizing to them.
Mm-hmm. I say it all the time. When you look at kids, they're the fastest learners because everything's so brand new to them. They're not quite jaded just yet. You know what I mean? Obviously, I'm speaking for kids that haven't undergone crazy trauma at such an early age, because I'm talking about just in general. If you think of kids, they're almost like a blank canvas in terms of like literally their receptors are open to everything that's going on around them. So they're picking up things left and right. And they are keen observers. Mm-hmm. They will watch your every move. I am blessed to have a super close relationship with my godchildren, my nieces and nephews, and I love them. They love me. I hope they do. I spend a lot of time with them, and I genuinely try to speak to them, and just let them be heard and stuff like that. And but honestly, it's just so fun to observe them and watch them grow, because they're literally picking things up left and right. And sometimes you're just like, where the hell did you learn that from? Like, when did you start using that word? Or like, you know what I'm saying? So it's like, we got like, in knowing that as a parent, and God willing, at some point when I, when the universe is deemed so, I feel like when I have kids, I want to be able to just, I guess, kind of be that way for them, in terms of the way that you kind of just described, just kind of helping them learn, but being their, their safe space, just kind of helping guide them and things like that. So, when you were going through your own trauma and your own childhood and stuff like that, did that kind of make you want to completely change your parenting style? Obviously, like, you don't want them to go through as the difficulty that you went through, but what about your childhood really kind of like made you select the parenting style that you have?
Well, I mean, I think one, definitely not being in a house where it was safe to vocalize yourself was probably the most important aspect of it. But also just, I think a lot of it like really like stemmed from, like psychology, right? Like I learning, things that are like damaging to kids. I think that was also an element of like my parenting style. But I also have like 12 nieces and nephews. So like I was raised, like I lived with my sister for a while, and she had like a daughter, and I was always like with her daughter. Like she was basically my kid. So like I genuinely had that experience. And I also worked at a daycare like through like most of my high school, like during the summer too. So just like seeing like very calm and calm environments where kids who were, obviously acting out because of whatever circumstance, allowed me to like really like hone in on that like nurture. That nurturer. But I always say like I always wanted to be like the mother that like I know that my mom wanted to be, because like my mom died like right before I turned 2 years old, and any experience that like anything that I experience in terms of like what people say about her has like always been like, wow, your mom loved you guys so much. She was like always present. She, you know, she was the fun aunt and stuff like that. And so I genuinely contribute my parenting to her, right? Like, because she didn't get to like experience that with us.
Wow, that's beautiful. So it's like a homage to your mom, and and just paying respects to her, and just wanting to be the best you can be for your kids and for yourself and for your mom, right? It's a beautiful thing. That actually, as you were saying that, like I just recently did a podcast episode with my boy Hatch, OG Hatch, and his father was murdered at the age of when he was 3 years old, and so I can't say that I can understand what that is because I had both my parents, even though they broke up when I was 8 years old. You know what I mean? But I had my mom. I still had access to her and my dad, and so I can't even begin to fully comprehend what that feeling is to lose a parent at that age, especially when you need so much from your parents at that age. So I just and just seeing your story continue to come full circle like it is, it's just a testimony to your strength and your faith, who you point to God a lot. And it's incredible. So that's why I know, like, I really believe the work that you're doing is going to produce so much fruit for you and your loved ones, because you have the intention of helping other people. And Trev asked this in the podcast that you guys did, but maybe we could just talk about this a little bit more. Why do you feel like it's important for you to help other people?
I think so many people are just genuinely lost. And people are seekers, right? Like they're always looking for answers. They're trying to get to know themselves on a personal level, and not just a clinical level, right? Like you can go through all of the therapy that you want, but who are you, right? Like who are you like in this world? Like what does that mean for you? And I struggled with that. Like I struggled, in terms of like relationships or being around people, and the expectations that people have on you. And for me, it's like, how can I help people like authentically live their truth? Like, how can I get people to like actually, defy all odds, or defy the direction of the world to like genuinely be who they are, like who God or the universe intended them to. But I think also for me, like I wish I had that growing up, right? Like, and I, not to say that I didn't have really good mentors during that time of like my adolescence, but it's like I wish someone would have gave me these tools sooner. Like I wish I would have known this. And not that I regret anything that happened in my life, but it's like, would my life look differently? Probably. I can still be thankful for like the experiences, but I also could be open and receptive to the idea of my life have taken a completely different course if someone had already like given me the tools for this.
Yeah. Wow. That's well, great answer. First of all, like I really appreciate that answer. And it's sometimes when we look back on life, and I'm guilty of this myself, you kind of, I guess our trauma becomes so much of who we think we are, right? We feel like it's so much of who we think we are that we feel like it's a part of our identity that we just can't change, when that's really not the case, right? We always, every day we get a chance to wake up is a new chance to make progress towards reinventing ourselves, towards learning something new, towards changing our entire experience of life, right? And I think that trauma sometimes can be so deep in terms of, and it's so hurtful that like, and it's so heavy, right? That you just like can't help but hold on. But when you learn to practice acceptance and letting it go and making peace with it, right? That can really propel you to move forward at an even like faster pace, and then thus enhancing your like entire experience of life, right? I really feel like you see it that way because you strike me as such an optimistic person, and you know what I mean? Like you just got a lot going on for yourself, you know what I'm saying? Which is really dope to see, and I'm glad we connected. But so I'm curious because you have done work in the mental health space, and you know you continue to do work in that space, and like you mentioned, you're studying to become a therapist. I'm curious from my personal standpoint, and I definitely feel like I want to revisit this at some point. I'd love to have you on here when you eventually are like a therapist. I know you mentioned like you're not going to be like a practicing therapist, right? But I was curious from my end because trauma is a really difficult thing to deal with if you don't know what you're doing, right? If you don't quite know how to process it. I was always curious about a therapist's approach to not only dealing with their own trauma, but dealing with the trauma that's being kind of like vomited on them. You know what I'm saying? Like when people are kind of in
Yeah.
their office and stuff like that. So I'm curious, like what is that process like?
I mean, I have my own therapist. um, and whatever, like I probably don't like need her right at this point in my life or whatever, but it is good, right? Like to be able to dump your shit on somebody else. Like um and so it's that, but I think I also do a lot of things that are intentional or whatever, of like grounding myself, right? Like I try to be very intentional about like Mondays I tend to like not do any work, right? Because that's the only day consistently every week that I have to myself, where I don't have kids. And so Mondays for me are always like my days of rest, right? So I will just do things for myself, right? Like clean my house, like organize, take myself out to like get food or whatever the case may be. Like it's completely shameless. And then always like ending my week, like I see my therapist like every Friday, or we Zoom or whatever the case might be. Like we talk on the phone, like every Friday. Like that's how I end my week. So I start my week or whatever with like being very intentional about the time that I'm spending by myself to kind of like get a start on my week. And then I always end it with a like, this needs to like de-stress from everything that happened this week. So it's really about balance. I think people need to like really learn how to take time for themselves and like actually spend time alone. But I don't think a lot of people are comfortable with that, right? Like the ego dying is so foreign to people. Like the idea of spending time with them is like jumping off a bridge, right? Like even if they are alone, then they're scrolling on Instagram, or they have to talk on the phone, they have to do this, they have to do that, versus like can you actually sit in peace by yourself, right? Like can you actually like just journal and write and color, do whatever you need to do or whatever to be in that safe space. It's like when we genuinely feel that our bodies are sacred and it's safe enough for us to be in it, that's true healing. That's when we actually grow.
That's peace.
That's peace.
That is inner peace. And peace. Wow, you honestly throughout this conversation, I feel like you've touched on so many different things that I'm like, we could make like entire episodes on certain topics.
Yeah.
And one being that you just kind of like briefly touched on was the fact that like some people are scared to be by themselves. I clearly just told you earlier, I'm not sure if we recorded this, but it was maybe in our pre-brief, that I definitely was somebody that for the life of me could not be alone. Like I just was like, I needed to either be around some friends or family, or I needed to do something to distract me from me, because my mind was racing at such incredible rates. And I was just like, if I felt that if I was alone with me, myself, and I, something bad was going to happen. You know what I'm saying? And it was just a very scary thing to do. And what you said was so important about just like really just forcing yourself to be on your own and just like learn who you are. Because when I did that, yeah, it was scary at first. You know, when I first took up meditation and when I first took up journaling and being by myself and going to places by myself, I got to genuinely know who I am. And then through that process, you know what you're not too, right? You know that like your experiences doesn't have to define who you are. You know what I'm saying? And it's just like through those moments of clarity, it just pieces together so much more of an optimistic type of outlook. And then you kind of take that journey inwards. That's really what that journey is, right? You go inwards. And now I'm pretty sure for you, like you recognize that when you go inwards, this is like you have this infinite well of like potential.
Right. Yeah.
Right. It's almost like, yeah, I was this way for so long, but that doesn't mean that I can't learn something new, that I don't have much more to give or much more to offer. And then you recognize your value, you recognize how you can help other people. And that seems to me like that's what you're doing right now in this very moment with the work that you're doing. Now I want to shift this conversation to the work that you're doing.
Mm-hmm.
Let's talk about Reclaimed a little bit. Let's
Yeah.
talk about the mission behind it. I'm pretty, throughout this conversation, you've already talked about so much that I feel like ties into your brand. But let's let you get more granular and really explain it and just dive into it a little bit more. How is what is the mission behind Reclaim?
Reclaimed is genuinely people getting back to individuality. That's genuinely what it is, right? Of how people can be more of themselves and not necessarily look at something, their trauma, as who they are, or their behaviors and actions as who they are, but more so in a sense of a result of something that was like essentially like positioned on them. So it starts with an identity breakdown, right? Like, who are you genuinely, right? Like what does like nature and nurture, like how does nature and nurture like play a part in like who you are? How does trauma play a part in who you are? Then there's, a bunch of like different like journal prompts throughout it, like self-reflective journal prompts and stuff like that for people to do like after like essentially every exercise. I think it's 25 modules. I think, yeah, like 25 different like modules and stuff like that. And there's like journal prompts and videos throughout the entire thing. There's also 2 different exercises. So there's like a huge universal needs list. And there's also this like values exercise. Like I complete the values exercise every 6 months. It's just something that I do, especially when I'm like setting new goals for myself, just making sure that like the goals that I'm setting are still aligned with my values. And I feel like that's very important for people to continue to do. But yeah, it's really about like unpacking all of the things that we've told ourselves or everything that we hear on the media and getting back to the root of who we are, like aside of trauma, right? Like we aren't our trauma, right? Like we can't control our circumstances or our relationships when we're operating out of trauma. We need to genuinely heal that aspect of us in order to begin deepening the relationship that we have with ourselves and others.
Beautifully said. Beautifully said. And great brand. You guys are doing fantastic work over there. And I know you're all doing it independently. You also wrote a book. The book is called Sober Minds Flying Free.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that? The whole process? Actually, one of my biggest goals, and I fully intend on fulfilling this goal, is to write at least one book before my time is up on earth. Maybe a few. I have to kind of just let that pen flow and just let it do its thing. But again, when the universe deems that the time is right, it will be done. You know what I mean? So I'm curious about this book. The process behind it. I just want you to speak on it. Go ahead.
Yeah. So it's actually a poetry book, and it's genuinely the relationship that I had with my ex, a little bit of the relationship that I had with my dad, and how that played a part in the relationships that I was choosing. And yeah, so like it went from like the abuse that I endured, how I felt in those moments, essentially me leaving and then eventually like finding peace. So that's why it's like sober minds, is because like I'm actually putting everything out there of like the most intimate like moments of my life. Like I think I even talked about like falling into like a huge depression during that time. And then being able to like actually release that anger and resentment that I had for my ex, and like genuinely like extend grace to him and like offer grace to him. So yeah. It's just essentially, yeah, just like a bunch of different poems of those moments of being there and like feeling trapped and feeling afraid and feeling alone and isolated and stuff like that.
You mentioned also that you are writing another book. Is that right?
Yeah.
What's this one going to be about?
Well, I'm actually writing two because
Wow. Look
I'm
at
a
you,
little bit of a
overachiever.
I'm a little bit of a squirrel, so I have to like bounce from like not project to project, but I'm like, okay, well, this one sounds good for here. Then yeah, so I'm writing two. Like one of them is essentially about my life, and then the other one is going to be called Get Out Your Own Way, and it's essentially a book about healing, right? Like getting out of your own way, getting out of the like mindset and the limitations that you impose on yourself, such as procrastination, right? Like viewing your trauma from a very tainted lens. You essentially like being in relationships or whatever that are actually like inconducive to your growth and your healing. So yeah, it's going to be great. Both of them will be great, but I'm excited for both.
Sounds like you got a lot of great things cooking up, honestly, and I'm really looking forward to what you got to give, and the mission that you're standing behind and standing on, and it's just dope to see. So yeah, that's so dope. Now I really wanted to talk about a couple other things real quick before we kind of wrap this up. Not really real quick, but I want to be respectful of your time. We talked about your kids. We talked about a lot of the stuff that you do in terms of handling your own trauma and other people's trauma and stuff like that. I'm curious. This is something I wanted to ask you because I think you referenced it in the podcast with Smooth again. So you and your current boyfriend right now are practicing celibacy, huh?
Yeah. Yes.
Wow. Okay. So I'm curious about that because, that is, first of all, kudos to both of y'all. I from my understanding, you guys are in a long distance relationship, and so that already in itself is tough. So I'm curious, why did you choose to start practicing celibacy? Why did the both of you choose to do that? And then we'll get into what you're getting from practicing celibacy.
Yeah. Well, he started like going to like this church, and it's all about rebuilding the man. And yeah, so just essentially how the negative impacts of sex, right? Like force people to be unconscious, right? Or maybe like stay in relationships like longer than they've served its purpose because of that like sexual dynamic. But also realizing that like sex is intended or whatever to be between like two people who are married and who obviously intend to have children together. So the idea is like, if we want to rebuild the family structure, the nuclear family structure, we can't continue to have sex outside of wedlock, because that just continues to create children who are built outside of marriage. And the idea of families, like them having children, is the idea that like the family will stay together, that they'll stay, like they'll stay in tangent. So so that whole idea. And so, yeah, he presented it to me, was like, hey, we got to stop having sex. And I was like, all right, tell me why.
Wow.
And
So it was his idea.
Yeah.
Wow.
And
Wow.
which is, it's fine. Like, I mean, me and my ex, like, we stopped having sex or whatever like 9 months before we got married, and that was my idea. Like, and this was when I was like returning to, like, when I returned back to like God, where I was like, we can't be doing this, like we can't keep having sex outside of marriage. But yeah, so I think what we've really got out of it, I mean, I feel like for the most part, like our relationship has always been like fairly, like we've always done other things together and always like talked about like numerous topics, as I've said before. But I think it really is about discipline. Like that's one thing that I've really realized is like it's genuinely like strengthening like our discipline of standing on our like truth and our word of the things that we say that we don't want to do. Like I feel like that makes us like a little bit more authentic in that. But yeah, just being able to like find new outlets, like, okay, like what can we do, right? Like if we typically will have sex now, like let's go out, let's go do something, let's watch, like let's have fun. So like I said, I don't necessarily feel like there's been like a huge like strength in terms of like not having sex like outside of marriage, because we've always like had a relationship outside of sex, like especially being in a long distance relationship, like right, our communication has to be on par. But it really is about like practicing self-discipline, of like being truthful and honest. And I think that's kind of where we're at right now, like in our life, is like we can't keep sharing our truth with other people and we're not necessarily living it. So like how can we actually practice what we're preaching?
Well, being an example, right?
Yeah.
Being an example. Wow, that's valiant of both of you guys. It's just like kudos. That takes, like you said, a lot of self-discipline. And I'm curious, like, what are you getting out of it now? Like, how is your relationship blossomed? How is your connection strengthened? I'm sure that this does a lot, or has it been the opposite way? Like you tell me.
I mean, like I said, I feel like we've always had like a pretty like solid like connection. And the sex, right? Like I feel like people idolize this idea of like needing sex in order to feel connected to another human being.
Right.
And that's typically the reason why people do it, is like, oh, I want to feel connected, I want to feel good, right? Like, or they're like not even consciously do like having sex, they're just doing it just for the sake of it. And there's different ways to be intimate. So I think the strength is finding new ways to be intimate, finding new ways to be connected. How can we respect both each other's bodies and spaces without like having like taking it to that level?
Wow. That's incredible. Now, what are you guys doing for yourselves to do that? Like to kind of find new ways to be intimate?
Taking walks.
Simple things, huh?
I mean, like we're in a long distance relationship, right? So like we like, I don't know, like maybe see each other like once a month, like sometimes like once every 2 months. So I think that definitely helps, that that aspect of like us not like doing it as much. But it's not something that we struggled with on the phone, right? Like we didn't really like talk, we didn't ever talk about sex over the phone. So like it was just more so about like being in person, where we couldn't stop touching each other. So yeah.
That's real cool. That's real cool. It sounds to me like just the simplicity of life is enough to
Oh,
really.
and then we like just like doing prayers together, right? Like, or we'll go to church together. I feel like that's intimate, right? Like I
Oh,
think
totally.
there was like this one experience, like he does like a silent prayer, which is essentially kind of like meditation, right? Like and like I meditate, and we like there was one time or whatever where we like sat and did the silent prayer, and I was like, I felt so connected to him, like, and that was the most like intimate part of like our relationship being in that moment of like sitting in silence, like trying to essentially conquer our ego. There was like just something so profound in that moment where it was like we were connecting in such a like spiritual way.
Wow.
So yeah.
Wow, that's dope. It's almost like your souls, it's not even, you're just having out of body experiences where your souls are just connecting on a different level, huh?
Yeah.
Wow, that's interesting. That's interesting. Now I don't know how long I could do that if I were to commit to something like that, but it is cool to get some insight into, what happens. But I respect you guys for doing that for sure. And it seems to me that it's only contributing to your mission as a person, your work, your truth, as you mentioned. I believe it firmly in standing in your truth, living in your truth, because that's where authenticism is, right? Like you being yourself. Nobody else could be you. You're one of one, right? Like, and when we try to be something we're not, a lot of suffering can come from that, right?
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and you actually mentioned something earlier too, and you kind of touched on it real quick in your talk just right now about ego death and just kind of like the death of the ego. So, um, again, another interview I did recently with my boy Cam from the Unbiased Truth podcast. He detailed his whole experience with ego death, and I'm curious from your standpoint, why do we feel like the ego needs to die in order for us to, I don't know, why do we feel like the ego needs to die?
Because the ego presents itself as us. We will, ego is all about like needing to get something, right? Like I think there was, I guess I'll just kind of like touch on like an experience or whatever that I had. There was this guy that I was like dating, and I didn't really want to be with him, right? Like I think, but there was like that chase. Like for me, like it was always about like a chase. Like I was like I want this, and then once I got it, like I didn't really want it. But that's ego, right? Like anytime that we are doing something in order to feel good about ourselves or feel better about ourselves or feel accomplished, that's our ego. Like we aren't being authentic to who we are. We're forging our way to get to that place in order to to feel better about ourselves, or anything, like even in terms of, right, like a podcast or the webinar I'm doing, like my ego is saying like, no, this needs to happen immediately. Like this needs to take off immediately. I have a plan for this. I need this done. I need to be making this much money by this point. But the reality is actually sitting through the growth pains of what it means to be an entrepreneur. Like your ego is telling you the plan, but like the reality is that you have to grow through those moments. Like you have to be able to release something, is typically your own expectations, to get a result. The moment we hold on to expectations, we're living in fear, we're living in our ego.
Got you. So I'm not sure if you're familiar with who Wayne Dyer is. Have you heard of Wayne Dyer? He passed away a few years ago, but he's known as one of like the most well-known spiritual leaders. Look him up when you get a chance, if you so please. But he refers to ego as ego, edging God out. So it's like when you are living from the ego standpoint, like you mentioned, like you're edging God out, like you're not allowing God in your life to guide your life, right? And always thought that was so like fascinating, and so like it like such a great way of looking at ego. And actually, I was just having a conversation with my best friend, one of my best friends actually, about ego. And, you know, it gets such a bad rap, you know what I'm saying? For sure. Like, and I understand why, because a lot of things are built on ego. A lot of, you know, when things are built on ego, it's on shaky ground, right? It's like, but when it's built on a foundation of purity, truth, love, all these like beautiful godlike qualities, then it's the foundation is solid and it can never be broken, right? So I feel like also at the same time I was kind of thinking about it. I was like, if I'm not mistaken, the actual definition of ego, like the Webster's definition of ego is, it's like your own self-worth, like the value of your self-worth is what the definition in the dictionary says, if I'm not mistaken. And I was thinking to myself, I was like, like what higher purpose can ego serve though? Or like, can it even serve a higher purpose to like help us get to what we want to do, help us bring out our mission to life? And I was curious, like, what do you think on that? Like, is there a purpose that ego can serve that's in a good way?
I don't think so. I think especially in terms of like spirituality, ego ego tells us that we accomplished that mission, right? Like that we did it all of ourselves versus being able to be like, wow, God gave me this, right? Like, or the universe gave me this, or whoever like people believe in. When we operate from ego, like you said, like we genuinely leave God out of the equation. Like it's self-serving to us to accomplish that we don't even like realize that, like if we accomplish something in our life, like God gave that to us, God made that possible. But we're like, oh, me, because we're human, right? Like we want to take ownership of our accomplishments, not realizing that there's always a higher power that's actually orchestrating that exact divine plan.
Wow. Yeah, absolutely. And it's just like, in order for the things that we want to like manifest in our life, sometimes we just need to get out of our own way and let the universal intelligence do its work, right? And just kind of play our role. And, you know, sometimes that ego is standing in the way. So I really like the way you put that. Wow. Honestly, Stacie, this has like been a great conversation. I've learned a lot from you, and definitely appreciate the work that you're doing. And, you know, before we wrap up here, because again, I want to be respectful of your time. I kind of want to ask you to leave the audience and myself, of course, some like key practices that you can do right now to kind of help you have a better mental health, like just like have a healthier mind.
Yeah. Um, Definitely meditation, right? Like
Yeah.
meditating like in the morning when you wake up, right? Like I genuinely believe of the idea of like continuous prayer throughout your day, right? And that is just like whispering like sweet moments to yourself of checking in, right? Like checking in, like, okay, how am I feeling, right? Like what's my body doing? Like doing body scans. And one thing that you want to do with body scan is essentially like paying attention, right? Like tightening all of your body and releasing it, and then trying to figure out where in your body, like you're holding tension, and bringing awareness to that. But also slow down. People move too fast. People move too fast. And when we're moving too fast, we can't think straight. Like there's no stillness in that. So it's like taking little moments to actually complete tasks, right? Without procrastinating, which I do often, but like taking little moments to like actually take your time, like try and discover like, why am I doing this? Like what is this reaction getting, right? Like what am I trying to accomplish in these moments? So yeah, I think that's kind of little things that you can do to keep yourself. And say no. Say no,
It's
please.
okay. It's
People
okay to
say
say no.
no. No is a complete sentence.
There you go. There you go. Don't let nobody make you feel bad for saying no.
That's for sure.
It's like, that's basically the same thing as setting healthy boundaries, saying no, and
Absolutely.
just really doing it for yourself. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Well, I appreciate you saying that stuff, because those are simple practices I feel like anybody that picks that up, they can start beginning to implement that into their life right now. Just slow down. You know what I'm saying? Slow down, catch your breath. You know what I'm saying? And pay attention to what your body's telling you. Because like what we were talking about earlier, is like, if you don't pay attention to those whispers, you're going to be forced to deal with something bigger down the line. And it's important that you just pay attention. That body scan thing is perfect. I do that a lot actually too in my daily meditations. Is just literally closing my eyes and just scanning, just noticing where I'm holding tension, and just try to pay attention to that area and let that area just like release that tension. And it, you know, to some, it might sound like it's a woo type of thing, but it's like real talk. That mind body connection that you have can do so much in terms of making your body feel a whole lot better. It's like, I really believe in this saying where it's like, you train the mind and the body will follow. You know what I'm saying? And I really believe that. And yeah, before we get out of here, Stacie, is there anything, I want to just give you this space right now to just kind of speak on something that you feel like we didn't get a chance to talk about. I know that I want to get you on here at some point if you're willing to ever do it again. You know what I mean? At some point down the line. But before we get on out of here, I want to give you some space to just share anything that you felt like you kind of wanted to touch on, or just leave us with some extra gems. You've dropped so much on us already, but if you this is your space.
No, I think we covered a lot. Like I can't express enough the idea of people just being alone, right? Like there's nothing external that will ever give us the answers that we need unless we go inward. And so I just really want to express that to people, and for people to like, really, if you get anything out of that, this entire conversation, like, please take hold of that.
Well said. I follow this account on Instagram. You might follow this account too. It's called is by Young Pueblo, and he has a book titled Inward. It's a beautiful book, and his quotes are just amazing, and it really just helps guide, you know, the user or the person inward into their own selves, you know what I mean? And just really exploring it with a sense of curiosity, a sense of like fearlessness, because, you know, our temples are really, it's really hard to put it into words, like what that means. You really have to experience it yourself. So what I feel like you said right there is super important for people to grasp hold of. But on that note, Stacie, thank you so much. This was a beautiful conversation. I really enjoyed it, and I appreciate your time and all the gems that you dropped. And, you know, I really wish you continued success, and I can't wait to see what life has in store for you.
Wow. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. And until the next time, y'all, this is the end of the episode. I appreciate y'all for tuning in. Thank you so much for showing love and support to the podcast and to the brand. Until next time, y'all, stay up and stay blessed. Peace.